episode 1 of a beginner's guide to mixing heavy metal at home. My name is James MSV, and I'm not a professional by any means. I'm an amateur home recording artist, I guess. And what I found is, for recording heavy metal in particular, there isn't a massive amount of information all in one place. You have to trawl all over the internet to get what you want. Hopefully this series will bring together, for the beginner at least, most of the aspects you will need to get your head round to start recording yourself some fairly decent sounding demos. Episode 1 is covering the drums, and in heavy metal the most distinctive part of drumming is probably the kick drum. It is usually characterised by a pretty heavy low end as well as a pretty heavy top end to cut through the distortion of the guitars, often a distorted bass as well, and as you will probably be aware, pretty heavy vocals. I love the sound of a heavy metal kick. It goes right through your chest and it's awesome. Right, so how do I create my kick sound? First of all, quick tour of what I'm using. I'm using Cubase 5. It's about a year out of date now, in 2011. They bring out a new version every year, and like most people, I cannot afford to buy upgrades every year. I would advise buying an upgrade every few years if you can, with whatever software package you use, because an upgrade will be cheaper than the full product buying over again, and you will get a lot of cool stuff, especially if you leave it a few years. I upgraded from Cubase 2 to 5 and I couldn't believe how much better their stock plugins were. I will be using stock plugins most of the time here. Again, I can't really afford to buy a lot of the big sort of waves plugins that are popular with maybe professional studios. They're very expensive. I do have a few on this system which I will use, but I want to try and avoid that wherever possible and use the ones that you get with Cubase. If you're using something else like Logic or Pro Tools, I'm sure the systems and way of doing things are going to be very similar, so hopefully you'll get something out of this too. So, on with the kick. I'm using Easy Drummer. Now, Easy Drummer is a fairly simple piece of kit to use. It's at the lower end of the cost spectrum. It's at the lower end of the professional spectrum as well, but the reason I like it is that it does have a lot of very easily accessible and simple options. You can see I've got the expansion pack drum kit from Hell, which really you do need if you're going to be producing heavy metal using this setup. Easy Drummer is generally a rock kit and it really isn't that great for heavy metal. But you'll see here, if I look at the kick, plenty of options there. Same with the snare, plenty of options. Different makes, lots of good makes, and different diameters. Same with the cymbals. And to be honest, if you're like me, you don't want to be messing around with volume envelopes, decay envelopes, room size, that sort of thing. I'm not a professional. I don't really want to be spending my time fiddling to the nth degree, so for me this type of thing is perfect. I've picked my kick. I like a plastic beater to get that high end clicking through quite nicely. And Easy Drummer translates, if you look down the bottom here, it translates through very easily onto your mixing desk. Along the bottom you can see in these purple colour codings, I've got my kick, my snare top and snare bottom we'll come on to later. And it's this left hand track we're going to be paying attention to at the moment, the kick. The kick is really important in metal. You really want to be getting a good solid kick sound, and the kick that you will get coming straight out of something like Easy Drummer, I will play for you now just briefly, and you will see it's okay. It's a bit lame. It's, you know, there's not a great deal of anything to it, the low end or the high end. It's a plain old dry kick drum. First thing to do then is EQ. I'm using Cubase's own Studio EQ here. It's graphic based, so you can see exactly what I've done here. This looks pretty extreme for EQ. I know the rules with EQ tend to be don't go too extreme and always subtract, never add EQ, which is a mantra I would tend to agree with, except for percussion, and the kick drum is no exception to this. As you can see, we've gone pretty extreme here. I've used the Cubase default setting called Metal Bass Drum, which I've tweaked a bit, and I'll just explain how I've tweaked it so you can follow a similar idea with your stuff. Number 2 here, you can see we have raised the low end quite a bit, about 6 dB at around 70-80 hertz mark. Anything from about 80 to 105 is where you're going to get that good bass sound of the kick. You've got to bear in mind that your bass guitar will be sharing these lower frequencies as well. So think ahead to how you're going to want your bass to sound, but for me, my bass will be occupying this sort of area here, so my kick is not going to clash with it. It will complement it nicely down here at around 80 hertz or so. We roll that off back, which is a common technique to get rid of all the really low end stuff that you can't really hear. After that, the low mids and the mids of a kick drum sound just very messy. They take up a lot of energy of the mix that you don't need to be there, especially for heavy metal. You want that reserved for a lot of the distortion, so pull that right out. You can see we've got this here down at minus 16.4 there. That's really taken out. Then I've got a high shelf coming back in at around 3000. This high end will give the click, the characteristic clicky sound to the kick to help it cut through the guitars and the bass. This will vary depending on your guitar sound, your bass sound, and what type of kick drum you've decided to use. So experiment, find the right sort of sound for you, and you may find you want to reduce the Q on that a bit. I've got it quite shallow there so that it rides off the top. I could probably, if this was a better EQ, roll that back off down here past the 5-10k mark, but as I say, I'm using the stock plugin. It's not the best EQ in the world, but it does the job well enough. And if I now play this with that EQ, I'll turn the EQ off and on. You can see that sort of beefed it out a bit. It's raised the bass and a nice click to the top end, but it still is lacking something. And this is where the second stage of the kick drum comes in, and that is compression. And the principle with compression for the kick is pretty straightforward. I'm going to use Cubase's own compressor again to illustrate this. If I just turn that compressor on, there we go, and bring it up so you can see. This will look like most VST compressors. I'm sure you're probably familiar with this graphical representation here. The important things are that I've got my ratio pretty level, erring towards level on around 3.5. The threshold fairly low as well, so it will catch most of what's going through there. And all that really does is, best description is to tighten it up further. So if I get this playing, you will be able to see we've got that running through currently without the compressor. And if I add the compressor in, you can see it's like it's cleaned it up a bit. It just feels a bit tighter, a bit more powerful. That works really well, especially when the volume's up a bit. And that is all you need for your kick drum. That kick drum is now complete, and we're ready to move on to the next aspect, which is the snares. Now, the snare is another very important percussion instrument when it comes to deciding how you want your drums to sound. It's very characteristic, depending on whether you choose to have maybe mainly the top crack of the snare or the rattle bottom of the snare. As you can see down here, Easy Drummer allows both to be manipulated independently, and I like a fairly even volume to each so that we get both coming through and you get the characteristics of both. Different bands choose different types, but what's important, whatever type of snare you choose and whatever combination of top and bottom sounds you choose, you can still process them in the same way. If we listen to this dry quickly, a few seconds there, you can see that's a pretty dry sound. It's very weak as well. That's not to worry, that is how a dry snare sounds. Automatically, first thing you need to do is set up an auxiliary send in your program. Cubase is pretty straightforward. Over here on the right, I've set up this grey one here, Snare FX1, and back here on the left, top and bottom, you can see I've set up an auxiliary send. Now, if I press play again, we've got our original snare. I unmute the aux. I've immediately doubled the sound, doubled the power, gives it a bit more body. What we're going to do, fairly industry standard I believe, is to apply a lot of effects to this auxiliary send and mix the auxiliary send with the original dry sound, and that will produce our full snare that can compete with the kick. First thing to do is EQ. I've used a different EQ from Cubase here. Not my EQ of choice. I'm using it because I want to show you that you can use the stock EQs to get a fairly good result. With the snare, like the kick, there's two areas. There's a low end. This will give you the body to the snare. I've added a bit, 3 or 4 dB there, gives it a bit more boom. It's really quite subtle, even though they look like they're quite high there. The low end of a snare is more subtle, it just gives it a bit more power. The top end crack I found with my snare to be effective around these frequencies here. It's the 8 to 12 kilohertz and the 4 to 5 kilohertz I've raised. That adds a real crack to the general sound. Once I've EQ'd that, I want to bring it up further, and I'm going to use the Cubase multiband compressor. Multiband compressors can be a bit tricky to use. I've gone for one of the snare default settings. I would advise doing this if you're new to using multiband compressors. It can be quite confusing to work out exactly what they're doing. Treat them as 4 separate compressors that are acting on different bands of the frequency spectrum. And as you can see, just like with the EQ, I'm raising the 100 to 200 sort of area here. And again, I've raised the high cracking sound end of the snare to help it shine through. That's compounding on the EQ to basically amplify the equalization effects that I'm adding there. And if we have a listen to that now, first of all, if I'll mute those effects, we'll play the snare, still sounding pretty thin. Add in the EQ and the compressor, and it's got a bit more body, a bit more power to it. I'll stop that again. Finally, probably the most important thing for a snare, reverb. Using the Cubase 5 plugin Room works fairly good. Again, you'll see I've gone for their default drums medium snare. The length, short, medium or long, referring to the size of the reverb. The reverb is really what gives the snare its characterization. You could think of 80s sort of power ballads will have endless reverb and the snare is ridiculous. You may have tiny reverb that you would maybe often see in old school death metal or maybe industrial metal. Fear Factory in particular, one example that comes to mind, where they use a very small amount of reverb, possibly because they've got so much else going on. They don't want too much reverb taking up space that could be occupied by other noises. For me, I'm going for a fairly standard drums medium snare. I'm going to mute it a second and press play, but you'll see the big difference it makes. We've got our EQ and our compressor on there, and then add in the reverb, and then you get that real characteristic snare sound coming through. There we go. And that's a half decent snare sound and kick sound now. I'm going to play these together. You can hear them briefly. Add in the effects there. And so part 2, we will deal with the toms and the cymbals and listen to how the whole kit sounds together. Right, I hope you enjoyed that. Please feel free to comment if you think there's anything that could be added to this, or you think I've done anything wrong. I'm fairly sure that my theories are pretty sound for this though. Hope you'll come back for part 2 to see how the whole kit sounds together.